So the next one is 204, and the question here is, how should we treat our enemies, right? Some passages indicate that enemies should be treated with loving compassion, but others suggest that we should treat them just the opposite. So how should we treat our enemies?
Right. Well, once again, I almost just want to say by default, all these are bifurcation fallacies. But then also...
Either or, and so therefore, is it A or B? And, that question you should ask yourself when you're given those types of questions is, well, is there any other options, right? Yeah.
And then also we should read the text carefully and, lo and behold, in context. His little quip here is that we should read it biblically.
Yeah. The answer is, how should we treat our enemies? Well, we should treat them biblically.
Yeah. In what context are we talking about? So I believe here he talks about when someone is threatening to kill us, what's the response? It's different than someone at work who has a snide comment that may hurt our feelings.
Yeah.
Two different extremes of our enemies, and so two different responses. So that bifurcation fallacy can be pointed out when you kind of go to different extreme examples, because clearly the person wanting to kill you is your enemy, and also the person at work who doesn't like you, that's trying to get one over on you, is could be considered your enemy as well. So.
Yeah, and he makes a distinction, and you need to look at the circumstances, right? Clearly, if somebody broke into my house and was intent on raping my wife and daughters, I would do everything in my power to protect them, right? They are my enemies, and I will do everything. I wouldn't turn the other cheek, right?
It's different.
I would do everything.
Context.
And so, for instance, in a just war, you are fighting a battle against an enemy that's intent on harming those. But outside in a peace situation, and you're not at war, let's say, then you should have compassion on your enemies, right? Especially, if they're not intent on harming you in that kind of way, then you should have compassion. So Lyle makes a distinction between how do we treat people at war and how do we treat people during peace, right? And at war, we defend ourselves, and so we are to treat our enemies there, in terms of without compassion, but in peacetime, we treat our enemies with compassion. That's what the scriptures say.
Well, it's not to say too that there aren't examples that you can bring up where it's like, well, what's the proper response to this? So even things where you hear Jesus say, when the Roman soldier asks you to go a mile, which he's legally allowed to do under force, then you're supposed to take his pack another mile, so 2 miles total. So there you have an occupation, an enemy soldier, someone who could kill you in the streets legally if you didn't take his pack and go the extra mile. And there you're supposed to treat that Roman soldier with overabundance of good tidings. Because, yes, he may be your enemy, but there's no kind of immediate threat there.
Right.
So it's a kind of a nuanced look, and it's nice that the New Testament expands upon this. In fact, it seems like Jesus kind of doubles over when, how many times should I forgive my enemy? Well, you've heard it said that 7 times, but it's 7 times 70. So it's saying that, as Christians, we're kind of under an obligation to be even more forgiving and even more loving. And why is that? It's because when we understand what sin is, we understand that's what we inflict upon God. It's what we understand that Christ takes upon himself on the cross, and the payment for that, and how weighty that is, and then how thankful we should be for that. So even when it's very hard, like even if you have someone who's assaulting you with a slap on the cheek, that seems like, okay, well, now I can take a different approach. But even there, it seems like there are times when we don't fight it. Even going into martyrdom, it seems like there are certain times where you may be called to just kind of accept fate as a testament, which the early church did.
And we see that, in the book of Acts, right? Paul is slapped. He says something, but he doesn't retaliate. The apostles are captured in the early portion of the book of Acts by the religious leaders. They're told not to preach in Jesus' name, and they are beaten, right? Literally beaten in chapter 5 because they have preached in Jesus' name and warned not to do it again. And do they retaliate? Do they get up in arms? Do they, call the people to protest? No. They rejoice that they had an opportunity to suffer for Christ, right? So it's the context. You have to look at that, and you have to be sensitive to that. And there are instances when you even in what may seem like an enemy, you don't retaliate, right, in that situation. Yeah. So that's what he says. How none of these verses contradict each other by giving two contradictory instructions for the same circumstance. So you have to look at the circumstances to determine what's going on there.